Well, here we are, Dean Bagley.
Kevin Shively. Yeah, another week, another conversation, another way to figure out how we're coming at things from different perspectives.
That's right. That's right. Episode 5 of Asynchrony already. Can you believe it?
Yeah,
So,
and
one of the things go ahead.
I was just saying, just like we were talking about before we got started, I find it interesting that how much this has developed into a progressive conversation as opposed to a an exploration of individual topics.
Right, exactly. And I was gonna say the same thing. It's really become a continuous conversation. I think pretty much anybody can get, they could come in on any episode and probably get a lot out of it. But for those people who have stuck with us through all 5 of these first episodes, I think what they're probably realizing is the same thing we're realizing is that we're starting to really build a foundation, right? Some kind of a framework that we can use to approach different issues, different perspectives, and different things that affect all of our lives on a day to day basis and be able to address them in a way that not only tries to get our own position across, but really helps to explain and solidify what the other person's perspective is, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I know, I have found it interesting because the topic, the conversation that we're looking for today has been something that hooked me more than anything else that we've done so far. And I think it's a combination of those two things. I feel like it's really crystallized my understanding of a lot of things in this particular subject, but it's also a result of the progress of getting up to here. So I've done a whole lot more preparation this week, in looking at things and figuring out what my perspective on this was over what we had done previously. And, one of the things that I'd come back to over the last couple of days is to really tie it back to um, one of the most prominent things that I'm looking at in framing this is the idea that we started this with, in that why are we so divided when we know we have so much in common?
Right, right. Yeah. And,
So,
and like you said, this topic kind of came really kind of organically, right, out of our conversation last episode. In fact, when you said it, it just the light bulb just blew, I think, for both of us over our heads. And it's like, wait a minute, that's where we go next, right? And
yep,
that is identity, right? Because I think when we talk about different perspectives, there's no way to talk about it without talking about identity. And when we talk about identity, we're not just talking about who we are, right? Or who we think we are. We're also talking about who other people think we are, because that affects us probably sometimes as much or sometimes even more than who we think we are. Wouldn't you say?
absolutely. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, we have our picture of ourselves that's our own identity, and that's got different factors to it. But, especially in the context, like we're saying, of the larger discussion and the political divide, a lot of that division comes from the identity that we're assigned.
Right, right. We're assigned by the groups that we're members of, by the community that we're in, the families that we're brought up in, all of those things, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And
And
so,
another
it's
thing, and we'll get into this maybe more during the thread of the conversation, but another another concept that I found interesting, or another you know application on this, is I over what I've looked at in the last couple of days and been trying to tie all of this together into what I wanted to say. It's given me a lot more clarity into what my thinking on the subjects of our last three conversations and why those were important, and what I was trying to get to there.
right, right. We talked first about, conspiracies, and I think that that's gonna come up some
Conspiracies,
in this
conspiracy
conversation as
theories,
well.
psyops.
Theories, right, psyops, all of these things, and a lot of those and how we treat those things, again, come back to identity, right? And who we see ourselves there and how that identity, both self and assigned, as you said, affects how we address those and how do we come at those different issues.
Mhm.
It's interesting because when we talk about identity, one of the first things that people always think of, right, is the visual or the obvious things, right? Things like race or ethnicity, or that's and of course you and I are about as similar in that respect as we could possibly be, right? We're two very white dudes, right? But
Yeah,
we do have very different identity, and to both assigned and self imposed.
right. I mean, going back to the theme of the show, we have a lot in common. We have a lot where we're different. So,
Right. Right, because there's a lot unseen, right? I mean, you got the political affiliations and the ideological. You've got different professional roles. We have very different, careers, different professional experiences. Our biographies are probably more alike than disalike in a lot of ways. But we do definitely belong to different groups, right? Different communities, different friend circles and things like that. Um, there's a lot of different ways that we tend to identify our identity. But what it actually does in the end is that it defines kind of our role or our place in society, wouldn't you say?
yeah, it does. Especially in the context of the political conversation. One of the things that we had mentioned before, and I think this is a really key component to how I'm viewing this. Let me start out by saying, um, a couple of things. Going back to the template conversation that you had initially posted, that you had asked the question on AI, on political division and how that comes up. Um, the foundational idea on that was that we think we're operating from unified common perspectives, and we're actually operating from different perspectives that we hadn't realized. So, you know, kind of one of the things that I continue to see in, every conversation that we have is, are examples of that. And, you know, that's not a, you know, qualitative or judgment thing or anything. I mean, people look at things different ways, and, we get hooked into adding some kind of moral judgment or something to that. I go back to what I'm trying to do with all of this is, I'm very pattern oriented. So as I'm looking at what's going
I
on
think
in the
we all are to
world,
some extent.
um, I'm trying to identify patterns, and, trying to understand things kind of through that context. And for a lot of this, especially looking at the division, my natural inclination is to try to take off everything that's connected to the pattern framework and be able to just have the pattern without, the deeper components to that. So
Right.
that was where I came at this discussion. Um,
But don't you think sometimes we see, I think we both see patterns, but I'm not necessarily sure that we see the same pattern, right? I mean, because I think when we have different identities, we frame things slightly differently based on our experience and based on our expectations, right? And our immediate shortcuts of system one thinking like we talked about last time, and just going directly to our kind of instincts or intuitions.
right.
And we also put different levels of importance on different things, different saliences, right? We you might emphasize one aspect of a situation, whereas I might focus in on another area of that same situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some of that for me is looking at how much of that is the material that's attached to the framework, and how much is the actual framework. I mean, one of the contexts that we put that in, we talked about it before. Um, I've always really liked this as a means to do that. But, we talked about the fact that we're both big science fiction fans, especially Star Trek, but, science fiction in general. And one of the things that we really like which is a function of science fiction, always has been, is its ability to take an issue out of all of the connected baggage and moral judgment and all of that, which is the context that we're viewing it in the world, and allow us the ability to examine that particular issue or topic in a more rational, disconnected manner
Right.
away from all of our, pre-existing assumption.
I mean, in a sense, it's an ability to look at those situations or those issues in a more pure sense, right? In a more abstract, more pure, and hopefully maybe even more objective sense. Although we'll get to the objectivity part a little bit later, but that's I think that's what I like about it too, is the fact that we can look at these different types of issues in a similar way, or at least that are relevant to us, right? And make sense in our daily lives, but not directly affected and kind of colored or polluted in a sense by our modern biases and perspectives.
Right.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that kind of fascinated me as I was looking at these subjects is also how um, when we talk about identity, we also are talking about a reactive type of thing, right? Because in a sense, anything that would threaten your identity is something that is going to throw up your defenses, right? And so there are that it's kind of a gatekeeper function as well, right? Our identity.
Yeah, this may be a good time to interject. One of the primary thoughts that I got out of this is that I felt like that identity as a category is one of the primary triggers that we all have uh, in order to. It's like a circuit breaker, basically, to flip us over to the system one thinking,
Mm,
to where you know if you trigger someone's identity, they are now snap judgment thinking of things in the context of identity versus taking the time to parse out positions and that type of thing.
right.
Um,
It's a type of motivated reasoning, right?
yeah, and
Yeah. It's
and this
any
is
kind of information that threatens your identity. Of course, you're going to reject anything that tends to support that. You're going to accept.
yeah, yeah, and it makes that very easy. And this is where, for me, that hooked into our last few discussions. Um, I had shared I was turned on last week to a documentary series that the BBC had done. I'm assuming it was in the 90s because I think that's where it wrapped up, but I didn't look at when that was actually put out. Um, but it would have been really handy to have had that prior to our discussions on, psychological operations and that type of thing, because it was really a history of the use of psychology, going back to Edward Bernays, who we mentioned, nephew of Sigmund Freud, um, the use of psychology in marketing, and then the use of psychology marketing then coming into play into politics and it dealt with the initial Banana Republic story. So, the CIA and regime change and, all of that. Um, but that kind of underscored for me my thinking in our PSYOP conversation that I feel like that we're awash in this approach that has been developed over the past century of everything being presented in a means to to kind of hook something in us psychologically to manipulate our behavior. Now that doesn't mean in the conspiracy theory sense that there's like one cabal that's trying to do all of this. It's every company, every corporation, every news network, every political party and political candidate all operating to some extent independently, but it's the methodology that's being used now, and that's kind of what I guess I am reacting to in looking to have, that kind of discussion. So what I saw in this is the short form formula for that is if you take someone's identity and you add moral judgment to that identity, then you have triggered their system one thinking.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and we see this really prevalently right now in the, um, in politics in the United States, obviously with the pro MAGA and anti MAGA kind of, when I tell people about our podcast, right? When I tell them what we're trying to accomplish, and and we use our old, thing of, bleeding heart liberal talks to a 3-time Trump voter kind of thing, and everybody's, oh, fireworks, right? But the thing that they most, I think, immediately jump to is to say, how can you possibly have a rational conversation with somebody who believes that kind of stuff? And it jumps right to a value judgment. It's not, um, oh, that's interesting. You're going to find out why he believes the things that he believes. It's like, there's an immediate kind of condemnation of even the attempt in some ways to
Yeah, and
bridge that gap.
there are some immediate assumptions that are baked into that before there's like a 2 or 3 step process in that people are skipping without even realizing. It's like, they're assuming that they know what the other, whichever side they're coming from person believes,
Right. Yeah.
And I had another one, but I lost it for a second. But
Well, I think part of that also though is, it can be very exacerbated by the fact that we are so closed off into our own little circles, and that becomes very kind of self-reinforcing, right? I think, when the differences that we have when we talk about things like multiculturalism or pluralism or things like that, um, we have a very difficult time getting to that point if we're all just basically huddled around our own, inner circles.
yeah, and I think if we were to delve into like that topic in depth, what we would find out very quickly is that the two different sides mean very different things by that.
Right. Yes.
Or
Well, because they're looking at different truths, different realities,
right.
right?
Or they
Yeah.
draw very different conclusions. One there's a couple of different aspects that I see recurring in, the political conversation. One which has really bothered me for a long time is the assumption of intent. Um, I see things phrased almost all the time that you know each side views a particular policy decision and looks at that in terms of what they expect the outcome to be. And then what happens is that is phrased in terms of the expected outcome is what the person enacting that intends. So, and both sides do this. If you think this is going to work out badly, you have then put that back to the other side wants this bad outcome that's going to happen. And, I think most of the time on that, if we were giving people, the benefit of the doubt, they're trying to do that in good faith. They just think it's going to generate a different outcome.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we could evaluate that if we were going to see what happens and then evaluate the outcome. But, it gets into that moral judgment.
Right. Exactly. And it also plays directly into our immediate perspective uh, and kind of where we are in society, right? And when where we see ourselves fitting in, but also where we feel welcomed and invited in, right?
Right.
Um, yeah.
Well, that it goes back, jumping back into the topic of identity. That's another thing that I came up with on that is that, especially if you're looking at an assigned identity, if because this is basically within the context of group identities.
Right.
We all have an individual personal identity. That's how we think about ourselves, but it kind of changes to some extent once you identify as part of a group.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and we talked about this to some extent in the conversation on conspiracy theories that, if you express a belief that's outside of the mainstream, that you can get classified as a conspiracy theorist, which casts you out from the main group, which is one thing. But then you can find a community of the outcasts, and then that becomes your assumed identity, and that adds a whole, different level to the consideration on.
Right. It's funny because I came across something in preparation for this week's conversation. It was a concept that was introduced by a guy named Stanley Fish, and it's called interpretive communities. And it even goes beyond just what groups you're a member of. It has to do with your experience. It has to do with your perspective. It has to do with your self identity and your assigned identity, kind of both. And what he means when he talks about interpretive communities is basically that the truth or reality or whatever the meaning actually, right? The meaning in anything that we see or read or hear or watch is tied not only to how we are interpreting it ourselves, but how we have been programmed by our community to interpret it, right? There's a meaning that we can't ever truly get to real objective meaning because there's always going to be some level of subjectivity to it based on our identities and both individual and shared.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what I was saying about triggering the system one thinking. I mean, to some extent, the more clearly defined your identity is for you, the the stronger that trigger is going to be.
Right. Well, it becomes a shared narrative, right? I mean, if when you share a narrative with somebody, it just simply reinforces that narrative.
Yeah. And it might be a good time. I had mentioned when we talked earlier in the week how, what my initial experience was that um really caught my attention on the topic of identity. And it was in a different perspective versus what the normal conversations are. It wasn't race or gender or sexuality or anything like that. It was the fact that, during my formative time, you know, we share, which was the 80s, um, the identity that I really adopted for myself was as you know, a hair metal music fan, um, you know, metalhead, you know,
Hmm. Yep.
started learning guitar, so I'm
Yeah,
a
we can see
heavy
the
metal
guitars behind you there.
guitarist. So that was the community that I embraced as, being what I saw myself as. And there are assumptions that are made from the outside, and not all of those are necessarily true. And I mean, we could look into all of that, but it was like, okay, this is, and I mean, to some extent that evolved. It wasn't just necessarily for me an adoption of what the current trends were. Like, I mean, since I was a little kid, my favorite articles of clothing were top hat and tails. I've worn cowboy boots since I wore shoes. And I never liked getting my hair cut. I had an uncle that had long hair, uh, and just, I kind of always gravitated to that.
By the
I
way,
mean,
that doesn't work for all of us. I didn't get a haircut all last year, and this is still my head.
yeah, I didn't either. But so to some extent, that was the world adapting to me. You have this long-haired person in a tailcoat, leather pants, and cowboy boots. That was the uniform of the '80s, and that just happened to be what I wanted to wear.
Right. Right.
So that's
And to
all
some extent, that's
great.
still your self-identity, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's all
Regardless
great.
of
That's all
whether
fine and
society
dandy.
wants to let you be that or not.
Yeah. So, that's all going along fine until we get to the year 1993. Um, it's fairly well documented at this point that for whatever reason you want to look at, the music industry decided at that point that that was something that you could no longer do.
Right, right.
It just
It was
wasn't.
passé.
Yeah, it wasn't, and it was not just that they were promoting a different trend, it was not just that they were going in a different direction, it was forbidden. I mean, I've seen stories of people that were DJs in the industry and that type of thing that, at one point they came in, they threw all of those CDs in boxes, they took them out of the radio station. You can't, you know, you can't talk about that anymore. So,
Right.
that really struck me at that point is like, so why do other people have the right to tell me who I can be?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's, and do you think that may have played into your sense of kind of defending your individualism and your, your sense of self-liberty?
Absolutely. That's still a huge trigger for me. I have not gotten over that yet.
Right. Okay.
Um, so, when I look at that, I'm able to look at that in the context of this conversation and know
Mhm.
that I have that. I can identify that in myself. It's something that's outside of the political conversation. And I know that if somebody brings up some aspect of that is, you know, sets them in opposition to me in that conversation, that's a huge trigger for me.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
it's interesting because you brought this up as far as the music, and we've talked a lot about this because obviously both of us, music is a huge part of both of our lives, right? And we both see, and it's also a massive part of both of our self identities, right? Is our thinking of ourselves as a musician, as people who play music, and our music lovers, right? But it's we talk about this from the political standpoint because that's kind of the underpinnings or the undercurrent of our conversation, right? But it happens in all kinds of things, especially music. I mean, look at what happens when a country star wants to cross over and play rock and roll, or heaven forbid classical music, right? Or something like that, or a classical musician, actually takes the extravagant step of wanting to release a pop album, right? Or something like that. That's it's a very difficult prospect because even though they want to have some control over their identity and be able to expand that identity or maybe even change it altogether, there's a huge a force that it tries to prevent them from doing that, right? And tries to say, no, 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 that's not who you are.
did you ever see the movie Crossroads with Ralph Macchio?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Steve Vai
aside
was in
from
that, right?
that being my favorite guitar performance in cinema, the duel at the end with my favorite guitarist at this time, Steve Vai, that's
Amazing.
exactly what that is. He's
Yes.
he's at Juilliard training in classical music with the love of the blues.
Right. Yep. Well, look at what
And
happened when Beyonce wanted to release a classic or a country album, right?
right. Well, and I mean, I don't necessarily want to jump into this as the topic of conversation, but that triggered the identity conversation.
Well, it did, and it's important though to talk about because if it's that case and we are kind of restrictive in our generosity, right, to other people in their identities, then that is going to directly affect how we talk politics with people, right?
Right.
I mean, you
But
can't. How could it not?
the reaction to that was that people had an issue with Beyonce doing a country album because of her ethnic identity,
Right. Right.
which, triggers the political conversation. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting when NPR did a story, that was their angle, right? What they did was they talked about other black country artists to kind of remind people that they do exist, right,
And I have to wonder if there wouldn't have been a similarly negative reaction, like if Eminem had wanted to do a country album.
right, right. Yeah, well, that's a very valid point, right? Because then you start to get into issues of intersectionality, right? Where you've got multiple factors that people are using to try to define a person's identity.
Right. And, you know, this is one of the concepts that I kind of came up with on this, um, was that, if you're looking at identity conflict, if you're looking at a particular identity category, which has triggered the in group out group dynamic, um, which happens with identity categories a lot. If you look at anything that's divisive, it's because it's going back to the conspiracy theory conversation. You're outside of the group, or you're inside the group. Um, so I feel like with identity categories like that those identities exist on an axis, and what people don't recognize and don't talk about is that that axis shares a common accepted premise. Um, Now this, I have an analogy for that I came up with a while ago, um, that I thought was interesting, and I had a couple other examples that I can give on that too. But the thing that made me think on that is like, okay, imagine, like, you know, this is not reflecting people's actual religious beliefs. Look at this as like an 80s horror movie kind of thing, where you've got, you know, going back to the satanic panic, you've got a group of Satanists, and then you've got like the Catholic Church. And, those are your sides. What, you know, what people don't think about in that context is that the Satanists in that context, and I don't believe this is reflected in the real world, but in the movie,
Right,
this is how it goes. Those Satanists believe everything that the Christians do. They believe
right,
they believe God, they believe the devil, they believe Jesus, they believe angels, they believe in demons. They're just aligned with the other side. But
right,
they've accepted that premise, you know, top down. So I feel like we get that a lot in identity categories too. Um, you know, and a lot of people don't realize that, and that goes back into the not understanding what the division is. Like, an example I thought of that is looking at, like, when we had the debate on gay marriage. Um there was the group that said, you know people who have same-sex relationships should be able to get married, and there was a group that said that they shouldn't. The shared premise on that nobody talked about is that the government has the right to decide who can get married.
right, right. Yeah, from a legal standpoint, yes. Yeah, yeah, and as far as who gets the tax deductions and who gets the inheritance stuff and all that kinda thing. Yeah.
Right. Um, so I feel like when we break that down into, like, the identity politics division, um, if you look at each of those subcategories, each of them kind of has the premise that what we're looking at, whether it be race, sexual orientation, religion, gender, any of these divisive ideas,
Mhm.
the shared
Or
premise
these
that,
identity categories really, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
any identity category, the shared premise that both sides are accepting is that this is an important way to qualify people.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's discounting the the differences in terms of the value hierarchy between the 2, right? I mean, because, for example, take COVID vaccines and things. If you're have as your value hierarchy individual liberty, right, at the top of that, then obviously when there's a mandate that you have to take a vaccine, like a government mandate that says you can't go out in public if you don't have this card that says you got stuck with a needle, then you're going to see that as tyrannical. You're going to see that as government overreach and a violation of your individual freedom, right? But if you're coming from a standpoint where your value hierarchy in your identity, because it is your identity that's defining this value hierarchy, right? Both assigned by the group and also your self-imposed identity, then you're going to see that mandate as a public health necessity, as a social responsibility, right? You're going to see it as something that is a sacrifice that you need that people should make, right? So it's a different evaluation based on a completely different value hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and a lot of that is driven by our identity.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, going back to kind of the basic thing that I had said earlier, once you have identity plus moral judgment, you're looking at identity basis, you're framing that dichotomy, and there are good guys and bad guys. And you want to be one of the good guys, and depending on how extreme people's views are on this, you can get to the point where frequently in these situations, the bad guys are not seen as people.
Right, right.
I mean, this was a feature of like Mao's Cultural Revolution, which was based
Absolutely.
on identity categories, but the people in they had red categories, which were good, and black categories, which were bad. And the people in the black categories, everything in Mao's China was framed as the people, the the People's Republic of China, the what was the name of their army? It escapes me right now, but
Well,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah, well, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
so
I don't
everything
remember
was
either.
about the people. But if you delve into like reading any of the thinking at the time, the people were defined as the people who were like the red categories, and the black categories weren't people.
Right, right.
And I mean, the most extreme example that we always look at on that is, the example of the Holocaust.
Sure, sure. And,
That
go ahead.
that occurred because those people were seen as non-people. And so that's how seemingly normal people could be okay with the ovens and the gas chambers and all of that.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And you do 2 different trade-offs, right? Based on your identity and also your position and your role in society, which again is definitely influenced by identity, right? It's interesting to me that when we talk about identity, we often use, specific vocabularies, right? I mean, different groups have different concepts, right? Different identities have different concepts. I mean, when we talk about something like privilege, right? I mean, that is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, especially, when you come at somebody and you say, well, like, for example, you're a white guy, I'm a white guy. Um, how much is privilege? And I'm sure we probably have differences in how much privilege we see gets assigned just by our being a white male, right? Heterosexual white male at that, for that.
Yeah. And I mean, we can look at that, but one of the things that I look at in that, and I don't know what this is true. I would imagine this is based on political identity. I would imagine this is a little more true for you than it is for me. But how much of your assumed identity of how you view yourself is I'm a white man?
It's interesting because I think that you and I are going to probably have different levels of that. That's my expectation, and maybe we should ask that question of whether or not we actually do, and see whether we look at those things differently. Because I do, from the liberal perspective, more progressive perspective, I do kind of see myself as somebody who has benefited directly from my whiteness and my maleness and my heterosexuality, and my cisgenderness, I guess you could say,
Well, and
right?
and I understand all of those things because, you're looking at, power dynamics and that type of thing. It's one of the things that I've had conversations with, you know, over the years. It's like, I don't, you know, I don't sit around thinking of myself as a white man. I
Right.
mean, that's not to say that I don't acknowledge what you're talking about, that there have been historical power dynamics and that can affect opportunities and that type of thing. I mean, I've no argument with that. But as far as
Mhm.
my own personal identity, that's that's not how I'm viewing myself. I mean, I don't and that's what's been really disturbing for me over the past decade is that I I was not going through life looking at, identifying people by their race, their gender, their sexuality, that wasn't a priority for me in evaluating that. And I feel like I've been cast into this situation where I have to think about that to some extent first thing as I'm interacting with someone.
Right, right. Yeah, and that I mean, I can see how if that is how you're coming to a situation, that that can easily set you on kind of a defensive footing right from the start, can it?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of going back to the Beyonce example because I think that works for this. Is like, um, if you were someone like, say, your objection, because you see this in a lot of movies and TV shows and stuff. The objection of like someone in country is to city folk. So the assumption in looking at that, like you said in the NPR coverage of that, is that the objection, and I don't know what anybody was thinking individually, but the objection is assumed to be that you have a problem with her because she's black and not you have a problem with her because she's an urban New York City person.
I can see what you're saying, yeah.
So, and I mean, either one, both may be correct for individual people. The problem comes in when you've got the political identity assumption, you know, where you're assuming the motivation of the other people without having the conversation.
But aren't you really just describing, it seems to me, the different identities of a being a person in a rural community versus being in an urban community? I mean, that in itself is an identity in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
Right. And we have a lot of assumptions that can be made based on those different identities.
Well, I guess
Now
I
go
guess it
ahead.
goes back to the point that I was making of if you're talking about if you're talking about opposite sides on a particular identity category,
Mhm.
you share a common axis. So when you invoke that identity category, you're assuming that the person you're potentially disagreeing with is operating on that same axis and they may be on a different axis. So
Right.
yeah, I mean urban rural is another identity access that we could look at, and it's going to have some overlap potentially between, black and white or whatever, but you know, I think that's where we'll get a disconnect a lot of times is like people don't feel like the person, whoever they're arguing with, understands their position because they're operating on a different axis.
Well, maybe that has to do with the fact that we have different experiences based on where we live and who we live around, right? I mean, because to some extent, so one of the dichotomies that people often talk about between right and the left, and it often then gets boiled down to rural versus urban, is the idea of pluralism and multiculturalism, right? I mean, obviously, living in an urban environment, you are certainly going to have experienced more multicultural experiences, I would think, than living in a small town of, you know, 10,000 people in the Midwest, right? or something. I mean, just statistically, you're gonna have more of a multicultural experience. And that can't help but affect us from an identity standpoint, and also especially from the assigned identity standpoint, right?
Yeah. And, and some of that is, I mean, it's a question of familiarity. I mean, if you're,
Sure.
it's like when I went from Anderson, Indiana to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, I'm interacting with a whole lot more different types of people than, what I was exposed to when I was in high school. Or, even when I went to college, you know,
Right.
IU was a very diverse place compared to Anderson, so it exposed me to a lot of different things. But then it's a question of, am I making value judgments on that, or am I just looking at these people as people?
Right.
Um,
Right. Well, that is the difference, right? Because I mean, when we look at racial justice concepts, from the right or from the left, we are using very different language, and we're also looking at it from the standpoint of, where I would might maybe see systemic racism, or microaggressions, or white privilege or things like that. Others on the right might see excuse making and victimhood culture, right? And just an obsession with race, right?
right. Well, and
Um,
this is where I see one of the conclusions that I came to looking at this. Going back to our original premise of trying to decide trying to determine why we are so divided in the political context. Um, when people talk to each other on an individual basis, regardless of what identity categories they may conflict on, there's a lot of common ground.
right,
Um, and the conclusion that I came to personally is that I feel like the political identity divide is toxic, from my
right. Well,
opinion.
yeah. Yeah, I think that there is a lot of toxicity in it, and I think one of the reasons why that's the case, and one of the reasons why I think this is such an important issue for us to talk about,
Uh-huh.
is because it is one of those things that hides truth, right? It's Identity is very often, I believe, a hindrance to truth rather than an exposing truth,
Well,
right? It's an
yeah, it's what we said
obstacle to
earlier,
truth.
where it's triggering, the system one, you know, your position on everything is predetermined thinking versus allowing the system to let me consider things in detail and,
Right.
you know, in more different aspects. And
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like that flows out of, thinking about one of the questions that we had brought up in our initial conversation, our introduction in doing this. Um, one of the questions I posed is how much do we feel like politics should be incorporated into, other aspects of life? Um, and I know this is something that you have a much longer history of being much more deeply involved with than I do. So
Well,
your
formal
perspective
politics
on that's
anyway.
probably going to be a little different. But I feel like, when we were teenagers in the 80s, the political divide, partisan politics was a lot less of an element of, any other area of life.
It was still pretty important to me. I mean, I was
Well, that's what I'm saying.
16
I
when
mean, I
when
understand
I wrote
where,
my, manifesto on Ronald Reagan.
yeah, and that may not be a fair thing. It may be. I've had this conversation with other people in our
Yeah. No, I
generation.
think most people would agree with you on that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I'm
so I mean,
probably
there
more
were,
of a political animal than most.
and it was obviously there. I mean, you know, Alex P. Keaton was a character out of the political divide that. and you hear the history of that on Family Ties, and it's interesting because they expected him to be the butt of the joke, and he became the most popular character.
I know, exactly. Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about, Archie Bunker, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of commentary on that too,
Yep,
but,
yep.
I remember, something like, as somebody developing, heavily into music at that point, like we had talked
Mhm.
about, one of the things that made me uncomfortable about U2 is that they're putting out, you know, blatantly political music, and I'm like, "That's not what I'm looking for. I just wanna rock and roll all night and party every day."
Right, right, yeah. You know, it's funny because I've had this conversation with my wife a lot because she had this conversation for a long time with her father, which is a educator, and they came down on different sides of this issue, a lot. When I was a kid, and actually probably growing up through my adulthood as well, less probably now than before, but I always used to think that, kind of pride myself in being a chameleon in the sense that I could kind of fit in with any group, and try to change my identity to fit. Like I could hang out with the stoners, or I could hang out with the rockers, or I could hang out with the erudite academics, and kind of fit in, right, in all those areas. But the more I realized that a lot of that was not real, right? It was just it was a matter of trying to find, or to fit into that group of affinity, and kind of bend into the assigned identity rather than really, kind of be myself, be my true identity in a sense. In a sense, that was hiding the real identity.
It's interesting because I had a similar experience, but I wasn't necessarily doing the chameleon thing. I
Mm,
was just comfortable with all kinds of different classes of people.
right,
I mean, I
right.
was a band kid, I was a theater kid, I was a metalhead, I kind of incorporated all of these things into that. I had put in my bio that people can read. I have no idea where this came from, but I was highly motivated to obtain a classical education, like old school. Like I studied Latin, I studied classical literature, was interested in Greek and Roman mythology and all of that. And I don't know why,
Mhm.
but it's so like the intellectual is another aspect of that too, but I had friends in all kinds of, every different socioeconomic status and, all kinds of cultural classes and all of that. So you know, I wasn't necessarily trying to, I mean, especially after I grew my hair, I mean, I am who I am. So,
Yeah,
you know, I'm not really going to be putting on different costumes to adapt to that, but I, I didn't have a problem being in those different environments.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, whereas I was the guy that had hair down halfway down my back at one point, and, before coming to an interview for grad school, I, decided to get 18 inches of my hair cut off, right, before going to the interview. And it's funny because I got in there, and the first guy I saw was the head of the composition department. His hair was halfway down his back.
Yeah.
So I guess it shows me, I guess.
Well, I
Um,
mean, at that time period, that was a real consideration that you had to have. I mean, you were,
sure.
you know, and this is where I have a tremendous understanding for people who are in the more marginal groups because
Right.
you know, I had to approach the world that way, knowing that I was going to be prejudged based on characteristics that I had that were visible characteristics. Now,
Sure.
you know, mine I had control of. It's like I could have cut my hair and tried to
Sure.
adapt more, but so I mean, I could see both sides of that. It was one of the
Well,
things
but
in
it also go ahead.
I was just gonna
You
one
said
of the
one of the
things
things.
in thinking about this conversation, there was like an evolution of cultural thinking and that I've realized on that. Um, I mean, I know, part of the American identity, we have always had a real affinity, coming from being the scrappy 13 colonies taking on the greatest empire in the world, we root for the underdog.
Right.
We root for the little
Yep.
guy. That's part of our identity. I mean, regardless of how much of the Bible anybody might know, everybody in this country knows the story of David and Goliath
Right. Sure.
because that's what we're based on. Um, so I have found it interesting, kind of looking at the evolution of the perspective of kind of minority majority going back to what that initially meant versus, as in most people are like this and then a few people are like that,
Right.
whatever
Well,
category.
what I heard you saying when you were getting into that was that, it just really emphasizes the importance of not using identity to make immediate and hasty value judgments, right,
Well,
about
I
people.
mean, if there was one fundamental basic conclusion in considering this conversation today that I could pull out of it, that would be it. It's that it's too frequently, regardless of whatever angle you want to approach it from, means that is used or adopted um, to, to again, going back to trigger the system one thinking and, create a fixed position versus being able to, it triggers that prejudgment.
Right. Well, I mean, when you talk about democracy, right, when you talk about from a political standpoint, I mean, that's where the problem ends up really becoming kind of crystallized, right? Because you can't really have a shared interpretation without some sense of shared identity.
Yeah, and we've got a situation at this point. I mean, you look at it every time there's an election. We had the important part of the 2024 election, 2020 election, every election that I've looked at, it's the 7 swing states.
Right.
The other states, we know where they're going, and it's the idea of, you've got the one side which is blue no matter who, and the other side, I don't know if there's a pithy phrase for, red or dead or, what. I don't know how that applies to the Republican side, but there's a lot of people in this country that they're going to vote party regardless. It could be a potato.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the dissonance, right? The dissonance is that identity diversity creates interpretive diversity, right? And it's very difficult to be able to deliberate across interpretive divides, right? I mean, if we can't deliberate, and I think we can agree that democracy or any type of political agreement requires deliberation.
Yeah, we need to be
And
able to break out of the identity predeterminations and be able to examine everything on its own merits.
right,
And we
but
need to
we
be
can't
able,
eliminate identity because that would be totalitarian.
yeah, I mean,
So
there's
we
an
have to
argument.
allow for diversity and allow for individual identity,
Yeah,
because we don't want to be totalitarian.
yeah,
That's not democracy.
people should be allowed to be who they are. People should not then be, you know, it's I mean, some of that and thinking about this all week, I mean, there's a lot of this that I don't know if I've necessarily distilled my understanding on because I mean, there's a balance there somewhere. I feel like I am much more supportive of someone's assumed identity than I am of the category of assigned identity. I feel like that can be problematic a lot of the time. But, I mean, there's going to be pros and cons in all of it.
Right. Well, I think where this leads us, and maybe this is kind of heading towards a wrap up for this episode, but I think it's going to have to be continued, because that's when we start to talk about not just an individual identity, whether it's self-imposed or assigned by the group or the community, but also when we want to talk about a national identity, right? We want to talk about a shared identity because maybe what we're really identifying, and I'm just throwing this out there, and maybe we can dig a little bit into this as we go forward, is that the politics of identity are focusing primarily on the differences and the distinctions and the dissonances, right? Rather than trying to find some similarities or some compatibilities. Because in it, if we are going to, because bottom line is, it doesn't matter whether Donald Trump is president or people are going around with MAGA hats or not. MAGA, the phrase MAGA could be dead and buried and relegated to the dustbins of history, and we would still have these divisions, right? That's not the source of the division, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
I have to believe that.
the sentiment behind what the phrase actually says, "Make America Great Again," the the idea behind that has been kind of the winning presidential strategy for like the last 20 years. I mean, you know, Barack Obama ran on hope and change. The implication there is things are not great. We need to do things better, which is the
Right. Well,
same
that is
message.
the difference between. I mean, that is the difference in messaging between conservative and progressive, right? I mean, progressives tend to look towards the future of of change being the operative way to improve society, and conservatives tend to say, well, but what about our ideals and our values that we need to get back to and try to make sure and prop up and support, right?
Well, I understand.
So and by the way, I mean, I venture to say both are true.
Yeah, I mean, then you get into the left wing, the right wing are both part of the same bird. Um,
Right.
but um, if you boil it down, both Obama and Trump are saying things aren't good; they should be better. So
Well,
I
isn't
mean,
it? It
it's
may be
hooking
more
that
what they're
same
focusing on.
sentiment.
Right. Right. And by the way, I can see how that would be threatening to someone's identity who um, wants to emphasize what's good about our country and our history. Right.
Right.
I mean, that can be threatening to that. And so, perhaps the key is to try to find some way to be able to say, because we don't all believe all one way or the other, right? I mean, just because you know just because I believe that there are some injustices in our society doesn't mean that I don't believe in personal moral responsibility, right? And vice versa, right? I mean, and you're the same way in the reverse, right? It, it, it's almost like when we talk about racism, it's gets into a difficult stance when you basically are saying that, um, well, for example, if I were to ask you, "Are you anti-racism?" Your answer is probably going to go, of course, I'm anti-racism." Right? But the term anti-racist is a whole, in a political context, it's a whole different subject, right? And it leads directly to identities that are possibly confrontational and accusatory in some sense.
Yeah, and there's a question of, how familiar are people with that? I mean, I'm familiar with Kendi's work, so I know,
Mhm.
the anti-racist
Right,
definition there. And that's where you get into language kind of taking things in
right.
directions that people don't realize.
But
But
that
I mean,
language
I
is shaped by our identity.
I also look at that being that axis that I was talking about. So, I mean, if you look at you know, kind of the dialectic version of that, you've got, thesis and antithesis means, you know, you're combining the exact opposite. And if you look at that argument in the dialectic, what you're going for is like if you've got, thesis, white people are better, antithesis, black people are better. Synthesis is, you know, both races are fine, or whatever synthesis you want to come up with on that. But you know the way that's presented in that argument is that it is anti, meaning the opposite of the anti-racism is reverse racism.
Right, right. Well, and that's where identity and interpretation of things are connected, right? Because we don't just have identity and interpretation. We interpret through identity. In a sense, our identity is the lens that we look through to interpret reality, interpret the world around us.
Right. And I mean, what I would like to see, which I feel like is kind of going back to you know, the the hope and the purpose of our conversation is to break that out of the partisan political identity and be able to examine things, individual subject.
Right. Because if identity is the lens that we see through, then nothing is purely objective, right? Then
Right.
in order to be objective, the only way we can get to an understanding of objectivity is to accept or to acknowledge our subjectivity. Right? It's almost like there's a lot of there's a couple of analogies there. One is, the first of Buddha's great truths, where he says, you must accept and acknowledge suffering in order to get beyond it. Right. You could also say the same thing with the first step in all these 12-step programs, right? The first one is acceptance, right, and
Yeah. The
acknowledgement,
first
right?
step is admitting
so,
you have a
so
problem. Yeah.
it's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing here with being aware of our subjectivity, and then to get understanding. I mean, we have to be able to recognize those different perspectives and different identities, and hopefully, some truth emerges out of that synthesis, right? Out of the merging of those perspectives.
Yeah. And I mean, that was the purpose of my relating my, hair metal story is that I acknowledge, I have realized and acknowledged that this is a part of who I am, that identity. And, that's why I'm looking at patterns and overlays and that type of thing. It's like if we can learn to recognize the patterns and repetition, we can be aware of that and maybe find some way to separate out that subjectivity to find more of an objective way to look at things, which was the science fiction example.
Right, right. But when we get into a larger standpoint, because one of the battles that's going on right now in our country and probably in a lot of other countries around the world is a battle between visions of what identity they want their community or their country or their nation or their culture to represent, right? And how homogenous that is, and I mean, we can get into all of that, as we go forward. But I mean, I think that's where we find a lot of dissonance, because I think that we can generally agree that the world is a more colorful place with a diverse identity, right? With more diversity and identity. And we don't need everybody to be exactly the same necessarily. But we have
Absolutely.
to be able to share some narrative and share some perspective.
And that was kind of where I ended up getting to with, my music thing. It wasn't that I necessarily had a major issue with any other genre of music or, it's like what you want. My issue was that I was suddenly in a position where I was being told I couldn't like what I wanted. So,
Right.
I mean, I would not have a problem with grunge if grunge was, like punk had been prior to that, or, and I think, and I've also acknowledged that, you know, I was tremendously aggrieved while that was going on, but I've realized the same thing happened a decade before to disco.
Yeah. Sure. Yep.
And I was very anti-disco kind of in that thing, but
Well,
I've realized that,
that's why I was anti-punk in a lot of ways, because I saw the punk movement come in and as a reaction to progressive rock, right? Whereas, they wanted something really simple and just grungy and just bom, 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 bom. And, where I wanted the Yes and Rush and all the, complexities of progressive rock, right? So, and again, that was part of my identity at the time, that I was a progressive rocker, right?
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but anyway,
So
so I think this is probably a good place where, do you have some more to go on that?
I just had a proposal for where to go.
Okay, go for it.
You raised the idea of national identity. Um, I would look at that as a component of what may be a good idea for our next topic would be group identity.
Right. Well, that
You know,
plays right into it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
raised the end of our last conversation. I've been doing a lot of thinking about groups and organizations and how
Right.
that operates in a different way, and to some extent also triggers that system one thinking, and because a lot of the identity that we've talked about, triggering perspectives and that type of thing is in the component of group identity.
Right.
So
Right. And,
so that
that's
thing, and
gonna
I know
that's
you had
gonna start to
said,
cross over into diversity, gonna cross over into, you know what I mean? It's gonna there's a lot of areas there. Yeah, so I think that that is seems like a very natural progression from
yeah,
where we are right now.
I know it seemed to really catch your attention, when I brought up organizations and how I've come to the conclusion that organizations as they develop, um, their primary function is for the furtherance of the organization. Um, so I feel like there's a lot of fertile ground for discussion there.
Absolutely. Yep, definitely.
And I mean, for me, that ties back to I had some stuff prepared on this that, thinking about Dunbar's number and why I feel like that's significant. And this will also play into something that you had raised with me offline this week. Um, the idea of the diagonal and, what you were discussing with your philosophy group.
Right, right. Yep. The diagonal that, Henry Sidgwick, talks about between the individual and the group dynamics, basically.
Right. Because I feel like all of that is the same conversation.
It is. It really is. I mean, in a lot of ways, all of this is the same conversation, but I mean, there are there's a lot of aspects to talk about to try to figure out how we can find that middle ground, if we will, or find the truth that's behind all of our different disparate perspectives.
Right. So I'll be interested to get more of your thinking next week on that, and we'll see where we can go from here.
All right, sounds like a plan. I mean, we're laying the groundwork, trying to find some truth and find some synchrony in our asynchrony, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, have a great week, and we'll talk again next week for episode 6.
You too.